Thank you, Mr. President. I know that you have other places that you need to be, and I'm going to be in the chair here in a moment, and I will not offer amendments because my understanding is that even though we're on the bill, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want me to be able to offer non-controversial amendments, so I will wait until they're ready for that just to keep the peace here. But I'll talk about the amendments because I have the opportunity to do so, and they're incredibly important to the underlying legislation. We're talking about the human trafficking legislation. This is something that, as co-chair and co-founder of the Human Trafficking Caucus, and as a father, and as someone who represents citizens of Ohio who are directly affected by this, I have a strong interest. I'm delighted the Senate is taking this legislation up. I do hope it will be not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan. And I don't see any reason for us not to move forward as the United States Senate in changing some of these laws that are in desperate need of changing to ensure that this horrific practice of human trafficking, sex trafficking, can be curbed, can be minimized by legislation that this chamber should have taken up, in my view, some time ago. We really haven't been at this for a decade. And we know a lot more about the problem now. We know, unfortunately, that about 300,000 of our youth are subject to human trafficking, about 1,000 in my home state of Ohio alone. So the amendments that I will offer, once someone on the other side comes to the floor who will allow me to offer them, have to do with human trafficking in the broadest sense. The First Amendment has to do with ensuring that those young people who are unfortunately trapped in sex trafficking are treated not as criminals, but as victims, and ensuring that those victims get the proper care that they need and the help to be able to get back on their feet. These are young people, we're told, many times who are between the ages of 11 and 13 when they are first exposed to human trafficking, in this case, sex trafficking. In fact, that's the average age, we're told. Having talked to some of the victims back home, having talked to some of those who are in the trenches working to try to help these young women, girls, and men and boys, I think this legislation is badly needed to ensure that we are looking at this not as, again, a criminal matter, but as victims who deserve our support. And specifically, it requires that every state put together a plan to improve child protection services, containing, among other things, provisions and procedures requiring identification and assessments of all reports involving children known to be suspected victims of sex trafficking, so better information, better data on this, a description of efforts to coordinate state law enforcement, child welfare agencies, juvenile justice, social service agencies, such as runaway and homeless youth shelters to help serve these victims. And finally, an annual state report on the number of children identified or known to be suspects, known or suspected to be victims of sex trafficking. The other amendment I'm going to offer will be an amendment with regard to homeless children and youth. As has been discussed on this floor before, the HUD definition of homelessness practically excludes the most common situations for families and unaccompanied youth, and that would be staying in motels or temporarily with others because there's no place else for them to stay. Even if the local communities identify these families or youth as having the most pressing unmet needs, communities can't use the HUD homeless assistance funds to serve them, except under extremely limited, nearly impossible conditions. This is related to human trafficking and also to sex trafficking in that, unfortunately, many of the young people involved in this situation where they're homeless, where they're not on the street, but going from house to house or perhaps staying in a motel, are sometimes those young people who are targeted by these traffickers. So I believe that these two amendments, which are not just, again, bipartisan, and they are, I have support on both sides of the aisle, but also nonpartisan, are ones that would be appropriate to include in the legislation. And at the appropriate time, I will offer those amendments.